Sir Robin Niblett, thank you so much for joining me on Al Arabiya.
Thanks, Hadley.
I want to get an idea from you of how you see the world today.
The world today. I think it's a world that is coping with an unexpectedly rapid transition that probably should have been happening more gradually, and in a way has been happening gradually for the last 15 to 20 years at least, which is United States stepping back from being what I suppose in international relations terms is called a hegemon, a country that feels it benefits from the system, so is willing to contribute into it.
Willing to pay. Willing
to pay, because in the end it believes what it gets back is more than what it pays in, to a position where certainly, obviously, Donald Trump is the ultimate cipher for this change. He believes that the world is taking from America, and therefore he wants to rewrite the rules of that engagement. Now, President Joe Biden wasn't exactly doing the kind of leadership that had been seen from previous American presidents. It had stepped back from global leadership in international economics and international trade. Its engagement in Europe, while institutionally helpful, enlargement of NATO, being very cautious about how to confront Russia or not. It seemed to be more interested in just wanting to keep the Ukraine conflict under control so it could make that adjustment to write the new rules of engagement with China. So you've got an America that's been trying to adjust its position, but doing it gradually, trying to keep institutions and alliances together, and at least the dance around international rules as being a dance that was still being danced.
Yeah.
To Trump, who's like, no, you know, this is all rubbish. We're starting again, and we're determining how we started. We're going to write the new rules. And the rules are really about what we need, and the rest of the world will have to muck in however it can. So this is a brutal change. But let me finish with this point here. Brutal for those who are relying on the United States. For countries that did not rely on the United States, who felt that the US, in a way, was even taking advantage of them, and that all these great rules-based orders that it talked about didn't apply to them as far as they could tell. A lot of countries across what is called the Global South. If you look at opinion polls, they're fine with it. Like, yeah, let's see what Trump brings us. Maybe it'll be better. We weren't exactly enjoying the past either.
Yeah. In your mind, is Keir Starmer the leader that the UK needs today?
Yes. Simple answer, yes. I think he is a good foil to the emotional, what's the right word to use, the emotional approach that Donald Trump seems to take, but one that just fires off whatever he thinks off the top of his head. If for Keir Starmer to engage in a back and forth like Justin Trudeau has done in Canada, even Macron, who I think has tried to play Trump right and is playing him right to a certain extent, but can't resist, you know, wanting to fly the flag for France occasionally in contradistinction to Donald Trump. Keir Starmer is trying to keep the relationship with America as steady as possible, knowing that it's a position of transition. And for the transition, we're going to need the United States contributing whatever it can. What he's done right, I think, is both not rile up Trump, but at the same time not step back from what he believes are Britain's interests. So, for example, you know, while Donald Trump is taking Zelensky to the woodshed, to use that term, in the February 28th Oval Office meeting, Starmer doesn't criticize Trump. They just step out and say, we're with you. And why don't you meet with the king? The following day, practically, 2 days later.
Yeah.
Nothing about Trump. Just sort of demonstrating continuity on the UK side and amongst America's allies, while not engaging in hand-to-hand combat with the Trump administration, which you're not going to win.
Yeah. It's been interesting to see King Charles pushed out as sort of this neutral but entirely British animal. In your mind, how useful is it to have the monarchy around when you need it?
You know, it's funny you should ask that, because I actually said to somebody the other day, it is a form, I mean, Britain's benefited from stability in its politics because the politics don't define the country. I mean, Donald Trump is trying to define what America is, or he believes it is, and he kind of represents, let's call it 50%. I mean, that's not a real number, but If you look at how the elections have gone, at least, he seems to represent roughly half of what Americans are willing to believe in or believe that he represents. But that then means if that's the head of state, America is either Trumpism or Bidenism or Harrisism.
Yes, or something else.
Which means half the population feel betrayed, left out.
He's got a 47% approval rating.
Yes, and you know, it's holding pretty steady. I think it drifted up, if I saw it rightly, to maybe 52% in December, maybe early January. It's now drifted down to 46, but it's still a pretty good number.
Yeah.
So what King Charles does, or the monarchy, it's not really the person, it's this sense that Britain exists beyond its politics. And in a moment of maximum international turbulence, to be able to deploy the king to try to communicate continuity, not communicate, not get involved in hand-to-hand combat, as I was saying a minute ago with the Trump administration, but being there to symbolize Britain's long-term relationship with the United States, which the state visit would have the king playing that role, but at the same time representing Britain's commitment to the kind of values and institutions it believes matter for European security, and then have a meet with Zelensky. So it's not even Charles who's meeting, it's that continuity of what British interests are beyond the politics of the day.
British interest, the Chagos Islands. Is President Trump right when he pushes back on what the Starmer government have done so far?
Well, my understanding is that issue, at least the last time I looked, was cleared for potential forward movement. I thought I saw following Starmer's visit. It was one of the issues on the agenda, and at least publicly, what the Trump administration seems to be saying is, yeah, we've talked about it. Maybe we can live with this, rather than using it as something to beat him over the head. So I think what you've got, understandably, I don't think this is a Trump position per se, this is a position of those responsible for taking care of America's long-term security, is that a 99-year lease on the Chagos Islands, even if it's renewable, number one, isn't guaranteed sovereignty over that in the long term. Secondly, what rights will the Mauritian government have to be able to do deals, for example, with China on the other islands around Diego Garcia, which obviously is the island where Britain has built the base. I don't know all the details of how that's going to be played out, but I would imagine that the Trump administration is going to want clarification that that long-term security for the zone around, what is their jewel in the crown in the Indian Ocean, that's going to be protected. So it sounds to me like the concept of giving sovereignty back in this very, very long-term then lease structure could be accepted, but they're going to want reassurances that the Mauritian government doesn't then have rights to do things around them that would compromise the credibility of that base.
Tell me this, for the UK specifically, we discussed some of these changes that the Trump administration has really thrust upon the world in terms of their own interdependencies. Some of these changes were necessary and needed. How is the UK placed today when it comes to defence?
The UK is a weird animal because it is one of the few full-spectrum defence-capable countries in Europe, including to the nuclear realm. Very strong special operations forces, a small, too small an army, 70,000 struggling to recruit new, a navy that has now 2 aircraft carriers, but doesn't have the capabilities to protect them when it goes, on long-distance carrier strike group missions, which is planning to undertake again this summer 2025 to the Indo-Pacific, having done the last one in 2021, but not having a sufficient number, a dozen or so, to cover the world, major ships with interest in Diego Garcia, Falklands, Europe, now the Russians threatening the Northern Passage. And,
you don't have the tonnage.
The list, we just don't have the capacity to be, everywhere. We're making commitments to Japan, we'll be there, a new security relationship with Japan being set up. So Britain doesn't have the naval capability, it doesn't have the physical armed forces to be able to deploy in meaningful ways to Europe, but it has a very powerful air force. The ships it has, like an aircraft carrier, are state-of-the-art. The armed forces it has, in particular the special operations, the Marines, and the regiments that are there, are highly trained, very good at their job. You have the nuclear capability, and then importantly, what you have in the UK is some of the best globally cyber capacity, cyber defence and offence, as was announced through the kind of cyber force, the new national cyber force, that was announced about 3 or 4 years ago, when Britain made clear it has offensive capabilities that it's willing to use. So you've got this sort of pocket Britain, mini-me capability across the whole spectrum. Now, you could say that means that it's always going to be stretched, and it's lovely to say we can do everything, but then if you can only do a little bit of everything, is that enough? Interestingly, given the world we're in today, what Britain can be, and I think this is where Keir Starmer is trying to take it, is a core player around which other European forces engage. And that can also be interoperable with American forces when American forces are willing to engage as well. So as an example, when the Carrier Strike Group travelled in 2021 to the Indo-Pacific, first time, the new carrier, Queen Elizabeth, out it goes. They had American planes, in many cases, on the deck. What's wrong with that? Showing interoperability between America and Britain in a deployment. They had a Dutch frigate contributing as well to protection because we didn't have enough ships to do it. But again, it brought the Dutch in, a European ally, reaching out all the way to the Indo-Pacific.
So, and you see this as the future?
Well, I think somebody described to me as actually maybe what the UK becomes is a focal point around which more interoperable and commonly deployed European capabilities, sometimes with the US, maybe sometimes with Japan, can be organised. And maybe that's the future. There is no European power that's going to have the capability to do what the US does. Even the US is struggling to do what the US does. Yeah. So I think rather than looking at Britain's capabilities as being too small, they're too small for Great Britain to rule the waves, but Britain hasn't been able to do that for decades. Yeah. And so actually its aspects of its weakness are a strength in the sense that they attract others. As long as you recognise it and don't, speak rubbish about us ruling the waves and, being a great independent power. We're not. We're a power that is a power with others, not a power by itself.
Does economic reintegration then follow?
I think closer economic relationship with Europe follows, with the European Union specifically. But I just don't see how politically, and in the end, even economically, the United Kingdom could rejoin the European Union as a full member. I mean, not as far forward as I can see. I think it's more likely that the European Union starts to develop a more concentric circle approach to countries like Norway, Turkey, Ukraine, saying to them, we want to have closer economic relationships with you, and those countries saying, we want closer economic relationships with you. But each one has its peculiarities that makes it difficult for the EU to want them in, and I include the UK on that, by the way. Just again as an example, would it have been possible for the European Union to do a 2-year loan programme worth 750 billion euros to help the post-COVID recovery phase that was then steered to deal with the post-Russian invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, response to the energy crisis? EU governments agreed to borrow on the market 750 billion and pay it back over 2 years or more. And the UK, outside the EU, is going, great, what a good plan. Inside the EU, the UK might have been trying to block it.
Yeah.
So the weird thing is that the European Union, in a way, with now not having the UK inside, is moving forward doing things it couldn't have done before.
Yes.
But the more it does, the more difficult it would ever be for the UK to engage. And yet, ironically, the UK is now more supportive of what the European Union is doing because it's not inside it and having its sovereignty challenged. So I think we're in a weird situation where, the UK, as Churchill once said, it loves a strong Europe as long as it's not having to compromise on British sovereignty. So what we want, I think, and it'll take a long time to get there, it won't happen even because of the crisis in Ukraine, is a UK that starts to develop a deeper and deeper type of trade agreement with the European Union, and it'll be done in fits and starts, and the EU will try to get something for fisheries in return for us getting something on veterinary standards so we can export our food products more easily, and we'll have to trade off something maybe on funding into big European research programs in return for us having a close relationship maybe in the energy market. The European Union wants us in, but they're always trying to get something back in return, and you can see why. I mean, we send 45% of our exports still to the European Union. The US is maybe 20%. But they send, I think the last number, we're the second largest trade market, but still as a total percentage of exports, we're probably not more than 15% of their exports in our direction. So 45% of ours go to them, whatever, 15, 20% of theirs go to us. You can see who's got the whip hand.
So the United Kingdom is trying to build up their defenses. In your mind, what does this mean for Ukraine? Who's going to be securing the security guarantees?
As long as President Trump is in the White House, Europeans, I think, are going to have to decide whether they're willing to, I'll say support rather than guarantee, support the security of Ukraine. Guarantee it would imply going all the way, if there were an invasion double the size of the one there is now by Russia into Ukraine.
And this is at a time where not just the United Kingdom is struggling with recruitment, Germany as well.
Absolutely, and Germany's in the beginning of a process of starting
Nobody
to make
wants to
itself
die.
capable.
I mean, that's the bottom line.
Well, no one wants to die. I think the bottom line is, at what point are European leaders willing to deploy professional armies to the defense of Europe without knowing that America's got their back? Look, we've been deploying in Europe professional militaries until very recently to Afghanistan, to Iraq, had hundreds of soldiers die in Afghanistan, collectively thousands, not as many as America. But those were professional militaries deployed because the government believed there was, I won't call it an existential, but a major threat from those countries being lawless and terrorist groups being rooted there and then threatening the lives of British citizens on British streets. And so we deployed professional military forces, not conscripts, to go and fight there. And they died thousands of miles from the British shores. Are we saying that a British government wouldn't be willing to deploy professional military forces to support, in some shape or form, reassure Ukraine, if we have said, which we have, that Russia's full-scale annexation of Ukraine would be a fundamental threat to the long-term security of Britain and all European countries? Really? We'd send troops to Afghanistan and not to Ukraine? I think Britain, at least, and a few other, whatever part of the coalition of willing is willing to put some boots on the ground, may end up having to do that in the next year or two without the guarantee of America having their back fully, maybe providing some intel, maybe providing some soft support on refueling aircraft or something like that. But my reading of Donald Trump is he believes, and those around him believe, that giving any European force that is maybe sent to Ukraine to help maintain a ceasefire or peace or whatever, what that's going to be, and we don't know yet, but if America were to provide the backstop that Keir Starmer is asking for, then in a way we decide whether America gets involved in a war with Russia, which neither Biden nor Trump wants to do, or wanted to do in Biden's case, or wants to do in Trump's case. And so they are resisting. They're saying, look, you go and defend them. We might diplomatically back you on that and tell the Russians they're going to have to accept it, but don't ask us to cover you, because then that potentially draws us into a war with Russia that we, Trump administration, said we're just not interested in being part of over Ukraine. And as you know, there's enough ambiguity about whether the Trump administration would protect NATO full stop, never mind Ukraine.
Do you anticipate Vladimir Putin to be still the greatest threat to Europe and to the United Kingdom? I mean, given what we've seen over the last 3 years.
I was about to say yes straight away, but I'm just trying to think about that.
Yeah. We thought he might deploy nukes. He hasn't done it.
Yeah.
He's been reluctant to move more.
I think fundamentally Vladimir Putin wants to rewrite the security order of Europe to one in which Russia feels it is able to extend its sense of security beyond its border into its near abroad, its neighborhood. Not just Belarus, but Georgia, is on the brink. Ukraine, it very much sees as part of Russia's near abroad.
Romania.
And then, the question is, while countries like Norway and Finland, Norway already in NATO, Finland having just joined NATO, Sweden, the Baltics even, which are vulnerable, if you look at where they are physically and how narrow they are and how quickly they could be physically taken if one had needed to. But I think he feels that part of Europe, they could maybe sort of threaten, but it's a pretty fierce force it might face on the other side. But Central Eastern Europe, the Balkans, Bosnia, Romania, Bulgaria, this is a place where Russia's traditionally had a lot of influence. The democratic governments are weak. If you lose Ukraine, how safe is Romania? How safe is Moldova, which was part of the, like Ukraine, the former Soviet Union, as was Georgia? I fear that if Ukraine were to fall, the Balkan area, Southeast Europe, becomes very vulnerable. And then, Europe as a whole and the European Union and even NATO, you've got NATO members there that might become the enemy within. Let's use that term correctly, unlike J.D. Vance's effort to use that term. You would have an enemy within that is anti-democratic. That's the enemy within for Europe. J.D. Vance, talking about the enemy within being democratic parties, reminds me of the fact that he's obviously supported an election that was lost by Donald Trump as having been one that he won. That's what I call an enemy within, when you start challenging democratic processes.
But in terms of those far-right elements, whether they be in France or in Germany or elsewhere, they are technically, though, a part of the democratic process, whether we like them or not.
So I draw a very clear line between parties that could be described as far-right or illiberal, to use the term that the Hungarian government uses. I had this debate with the Hungarian foreign minister once. He said, what's wrong with illiberal governance? If the people want to vote for being opposed to gay marriage, opposed to open immigration, that believe that Christianity is the core religion of Europe, and that don't want immigration from certain parts of the world, or believe in the sanctity of the family, I mean, take all of those elements. Why shouldn't those governments be elected? And I said to him, that's fine. I mean, if a majority of people want to be what some people call far right under those elements, or far left, where they want to have highly protectionist and protected industries and give more power to unions, if that's what people want to vote for, I'm fine. My problem is that nationalist populist parties tend to believe that the other party are the enemy of the state. And when they take power, if illiberalism means that you start undermining the institutions, the democratic institutions of the state, checks and balances,
but don't the liberals believe that about the far right? Do you know what I mean? Don't the liberals believe that about the far right, that they're enemy of the state?
No. But
so if the far right believes, you see what I'm saying?
If I can simply say that, but the liberals have not tried to close down, you might call them far right parties. They haven't tried to, if not imprison them, run, interesting tax programs against them, as we've seen happen in Turkey, where, it's a democracy, but you try to run against the government and you suddenly find, you're supporting terrorists, or you're
in jail.
Or, you're in jail because you did a tax, there was something wrong with your tax form. I mean, the kind of, the problem with the liberals is that they're not nasty enough. They don't do that stuff to the opposition. They don't imprison them. They don't run scam tax issues against them. They don't try to supplant the judiciary with political appointees. But we have seen that take place in Hungary. We have, when you see the new Austrian far-right party wanting to take control of the intelligence services as one of their requirements for being in government, and yet the last leaders of that particular party were caught on camera trying to sell public favors in return for Russian influence operations inside Austria. I'm sorry, the whataboutism, I don't take it. Oh, you do that to us, we do it to you. No. Those parties are not far right or far left. They are ultimately anti-democratic because they believe that they should rule permanently.
How do you feel
that's the illiberalism I do not accept.
How do you feel about German rearmament in the context of history, given the fact that the second most popular party now in Germany is far right? Is it concerning? Because I get different answers depending on who I'm speaking to and the age of the person that I'm speaking to, frankly.
Right. I think that for Germany, given its economic power, its position in Europe politically, its role within the European Union, and in a Europe that may not be able to rely on America to protect it, for Germany not to step up and develop an effective military force, for us to fear that for one of two reasons, either because of history, and what Germany has done before when it's been armed and heavily armed, or because we feel it's domestic politics. In my mind, it's almost to create a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think we have to trust ourselves as Europeans, trust the systems we've put in place of checks and balances, which is why I get very head up about democratic governments that undermine checks and balances. Checks and balances are the essence of democratic government. Elections are not. Elections can be manipulated, as we've seen all over the world. The essence of democracy is the protection of the individual, including minorities, by checks and balances that prevent excessive power or absolute power being in the arm of the executive. And when you're seeing Donald Trump doing everything through executive orders at a level that's never been seen before, that is borderline authoritarian, because you're saying, I don't believe in the checks and balances of the courts or of the Congress or of the media or of civil society. That is illiberalism of the sort that I'm saying. Now, I think Germany at the moment has some of the most powerful checks and balances of any European country. It's a federal state. The central government does not have absolute power. You've got a strong Bundesrat, a strong Bundestag. You've got a strong civil society. You've got a federal system where it's very difficult for central government to dominate it.
So you think that's enough?
Well, I think maybe one last point on this. When Hitler took power democratically, as somebody reminded me the other day, asking a similar question to yours, democratically, I reminded them that this was a Germany that was seething with the resentment of what they felt was their unfair treatment by America and the rest of Europe at the end of World War I, which they sort of didn't lose. I mean, they were losing, but they did not fully lose it in the way that they lost it at the end of World War II.
Yes.
And so then they had reparations imposed on them such that it really led to this sense of resentment.
Yes.
And we know resentment breeds a form of nationalism that can be very toxic. Look at Russia, which feels it didn't lose. We didn't lose the Cold War, you know. We were just a state that somehow was taken advantage of. And there's echoes, I'm afraid, of Germany in the 1930s in Russia today.
Yes.
But in Germany, Germany still carries the experience of the end of the Second World War, where they were helped to recover, brought into NATO, brought into the European Union, treated as a core member, one of the most powerful members of the new system. I don't believe that Germany is going to go back to the old Germany.
Yeah.
The Germany, let's call it, of the 1930s.
Talk to me a little bit about reform. Where are they today?
You know, it's fascinating because the weird thing about reform is Farage, well, where they are today is looking very strong, and they're vying for the position of the opposition, the loyal opposition to the government.
Yeah. And that is in spite of the internal
Despite the internal ructions, and they're likely to have them for a while because it's a very young party and it just doesn't have any of the infrastructure. It's still really a one-man creation.
Yeah. You still see them as a credible threat.
Itself. But the fact of the matter is that they represent, look, Trump was a one-man man.
Yeah.
No infrastructure, just a capacity to message.
Yes.
And then convincing some people with money to back him. And he decimated the Republican Party. This is not the Republican Party. This is a new party that's called the Republican Party. Now, will the old Republican Party somehow re-emerge alien-like from the inside of the new, like he emerged alien-like from inside the old Republican Party? I don't know. But it is, reform is that, but the problem is British politics don't operate the same way as American politics. Money is harder to acquire and spend, and I think you'll see some change to the law soon that would prevent someone like Elon Musk come in and fund it from Tesla profits. Hopefully there won't be, well, I say hopefully.
There may not be that much to work with
at the end of this. But there are some very wealthy Brits who are willing to put money behind reform, as the Candy brothers and so on, or sorry, one of the Candys has done this so far, one of the Candys. Any case, the point I make about reform is they are, you know, Britain and America have a political contiguity. We have for a long time. Brexit, Trump, you know, we're somewhere between Europe and America. We always have been psychologically and in terms of our politics even. So reform is riding the same wave of popular frustration that got Donald Trump into the White House.
Yes.
And the question is, can Farage turn that popular frustration into an actual political party? When you have a first-past-the-post system, which is very different to the American system. If he gets reform into the second position, then actually the first-past-the-post system could really favour reform, and they could decimate the Conservatives. But first-past-the-post system, I mean, you just need to, you know, get
yes.
a majority of the votes, a plurality of the vote. 32% of the others get 30 and 28. You get the seat in Parliament. It doesn't matter that you're only 32, and maybe 60% of other people voted for other parties. So reform came second to Labour in 89 seats. Second to Labour, not the Conservatives, not Lib Dems. So they are very close to that kind of breakthrough moment. Trump could become an albatross to that. People are watching the chaos here. There has always been in the populist right of the United Kingdom an anti-Americanism.
Yes.
It's not a pro-Americanism. There's a very small seam in the Conservative Party that are kind of hyper-conservatives. The Liz Truss and Duncan Smith wing used to love, you know, strong conservatives of the George W. Bush mold. But Trump, even that is a step too far. So I just think the fact that Britain, this is a very long answer, I mean, the thing that Britain has 4.5 more years at least before you'd have to have the next election. We will find out in that time whether it's time that Farage can use to sort of establish reform, or whether reform actually starts to go up and fall off again.
Yeah.
And I can't predict that. I think it's impossible to predict. But I'd say in 2 years' time,
yes,
we'll know whether reform is taking over the Conservatives or the opposition. And I think that will then probably strengthen Labour. And it might doom the Conservatives because they may end up with a split party. Because, again, as I said, we have first-past-the-post system where at least a third party has existed for a long time, maybe a fourth. In America, you've only got two.
Yes.
Yeah? You could end up with reform, the Conservatives duking it out over seats, and we'd end up with much more unstable and coalition-y type government over here.
How concerning is the economic picture in Germany today?
Very concerning, because they've been slow to wake up. I mean, they had a model that was working so well. And
with
in
cheap
democracies,
Russian
when
gas.
things work, cheap Russian gas, open Chinese markets, and a dominant position in the European Union on the back of those two. That trifecta of sort of perfection for them, and a sort of undervalued currency, which allowed, through the single currency,
yes,
Germany's been able to dominate the European market, not just, you know, being a great exporter outside. Germany's biggest export markets are in the EU.
Yes.
But all of that is now being threatened by the fact that they've been sitting on that cozy cushion for way too long. And then maybe that's inevitable in democratic government. You know, you're going, if things are going well, let's just keep it going well. Why take a tough decision?
Yes.
Let's just get re-elected, as Angela Merkel was done. You know, three, at least three, was it four? Three, definitely three occasions. So Germany faces a big challenge. Now, look, Germany's been through this before, 2000 to 2005-06. Very difficult time. It was the sick man of Europe, high unemployment, low growth, sclerotic economy, and they turned it around. So I wouldn't underestimate Germany's capacity for discipline and for, but it is facing a tsunami of Chinese imports that are eating away at what is their key competitiveness. I suppose the difference this time, as I think about your question, is the scale of the Chinese competition. In a way, Germany was competing against itself before and against competitors that couldn't overwhelm it. But it looks to me like China could overwhelm Germany. So what I think we're going to see is Germany backing what I see Europe doing in response to the China, Russia, America threat, which is go back to the Fortress Europe approach. That's how the European Union was built, was a kind of fortress to protect itself against an overly strong America in the 60s, late 50s, early 60s, because the single market, the reduction of all tariffs happened in the 60s after the Kennedy round. The single market, 92, was built against protection against the Japanese threat. And I think we're going to see a much more interventionist and protectionist Europe trying to give itself space to recover, emerging against the latest China-America threat.
Yeah.
So Germany will have to back that kind of internal protectionism. Having been the great champion for open markets, Germany, I think, will now come in behind the French, who were always much more wanting to use the EU as protectionism. And then Britain has to make sure it doesn't get left on the outside of a more fortressy Europe. It has to somehow fight its way in to make sure it doesn't get cut on the outside of it.
I mean, when we talk about the energy dynamic, obviously, big questions surrounding whether or not we'll see Germany return to nuclear power. Is it inevitable?
I don't know if it's inevitable, but Merz is being radical, for example, in getting rid of the constitutional debt brake, which was passed with an old parliament.
Yes.
I mean, that's a pretty brutal move to make. Use the parliament that has lost power in the last elections, use the lame duck period to pass a fundamental change,
yes.
A constitutional change. It's still got to get through the Bundesrat, the upper house, so we'll see if it does that, but I think probably likely to. So given the fact that some of these nuclear, I don't know deeply enough how many of these can be switched back on again. If they can, they might. But I think we've got to just step back for a second. Germany and Europe, I think, are all in on moving power generation to green. Given the electoral drubbing that they've had from populist parties, in particular the Greens have had, in the European parliamentary election and others. What they're trying to do is take away some of the pain where the consumer sees it most directly.
Yes.
So in Germany, get rid of the heat pump requirement, probably loosen up some of the rules about whether you can have hybrid cars, keep internal combustion engine going a bit longer, keep employment in that space. They've changed some of the farming.
Yes.
Green farm to fork strategy has been eased up. So what they're trying to do is take away pain where the voter feels it head on, but try to keep the energy transition going. Why? Because right now, the way we avoid the pain of too much green is gas. Gas, when you had Biden supplying it, is one thing. When you have Trump supplying your gas, you start to think, wow, we were dependent on Russia, and
yes.
that was a bad idea.
Yes.
Now we're dependent on America. Is that such a good idea? And if not, then we're then dependent on the Gulf, where who knows, something could go crazy in the Straits of Hormuz.
Do you think really people equate Donald Trump with Vladimir Putin today?
People in Europe certainly do. Absolutely. In fact, I'm afraid they equate him with worse parts of British history. Well, they equate, Putin with Hitler, and the parallels are similar if you take out the final solution and the Jewish question, as the Nazis called it. So
I mean, that's gone beyond rhetoric. That's the case that people see the same.
I think the view of Putin as Hitlerian is firmly established. The fact that people in Europe and some people in America, many people in America, believe that Trump is fascistic is real. And when you look at Mark Milley, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, using that term.
Yeah.
And others as well in America using that term. I mean, I would say it's Mussolini-esque. I don't think it's, you know, he's got more parallels with Mussolini than, I mean, Hitler is a very specific historical parallel, which I wouldn't use. But if I knew my Italian history a bit more, I might investigate whether there are parallels on the Mussolini side.
No.
Yeah, so that's big.
When we think about Ukraine and those security guarantees, given the challenges that Germany is facing, where does that leave the leadership there? Because we, had formerly talked about Germany being the leader of Europe.
Yeah.
Is it going to be France? Where is UK?
You mean in terms of the leadership of Europe, or the leadership of Europe to help Ukraine?
To help Ukraine.
The leadership to help Ukraine is heavily British, because our public opinion is so supportive of them, so it helps the democratic space. And Britain has a kind of team with it, which is that Nordic team, some of which are EU members and some are not. It's the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is this sort of ad hoc military group made up of EU and NATO members and Britain, which is, was a kind of extra form of reassurance and giving Britain a bit more influence, but now has taken on a rather important meaning. But it could be Britain and France, because Macron definitely is willing to be there. The question is Macron strong enough?
Yes.
Now, he does have 2, maybe 3 more years at least on his presidency. If he can hold Parliament where it is at the moment, and if the current government of Bayrou can hold together, then maybe France can play a constructive role alongside Britain, and the president has a lot of influence there, but there isn't the same public opinion support, but it's pretty good. The big question, of course, is Germany. What does Merz's Germany do? I think Merz's Germany will swing behind Ukraine, but probably not as far as putting troops, getting too involved militarily. And you know what? I'd say that's just fine. More useful for Germany to be backing up what Britain and France and others put into Ukraine in Europe proper, to sort of be at the heart of an EU or NATO, stronger presence in that. You don't need Germany also on the front line with Russia, which is just going to set off kind of memories in Russia that could make Russia more unpredictable, but also would then feed the internal resistance that we're doing too much, which is not so much pro-Russianness as, we mustn't go back to the past, which does feed AfD. So I think, Merz has got a very interesting line to have to follow, where he leans forward enough to be a core member of the group that's making Europe stronger again without America, to be able to support Ukraine, but that doesn't go so far as to then undercut his own popular mandate.
Yes.
And I think the solution to that is to be big in NATO and big in EU defence, kind of on one layer back.
Yeah.
And that's just fine. If America starts pulling back, we're going to need that layer.
Much has been made of sort of Europe turning to China after years of being on board with the United States. In your mind, how quickly could that happen? Is that going to happen?
I think Europe, broadly, European governments, including Britain, are going to set aside some of what was the growing skepticism about China, well-rooted, human rights, unfair economic competition, its position in various UN institutions, obviously the cyber espionage and so on. I think logically what European governments want to do, and we've seen Keir Starmer and the British government, amongst others, already lean forward in that direction, is to say it's hard enough taking on Russia and China simultaneously, because at least we had the cheap Russian energy, now we're losing that. Can we also take on China? But to take on China, Russia, and America, which is about to, we think, impose new swingeing tariffs on us, all of them simultaneously? No, I think that's going to force a sort of new realism on European governments to say, hey, look, if you want to do America first, that's your prerogative. But then you can't criticize us for having to do Europe first. And in Europe first, we may need to do a bit more with China. Now, 2 very important things come in on this. Number 1, Ukraine. The reason Europe's relationship has become so negative with China in the last 2 years has been China's perceived support of Russia. Not selling it outright weapons, but definitely selling it dual-use technologies, supporting its narrative that this is a defensive war, and basically stepping in and investing in all the areas where the European companies had to pull out. And there's the bigger narrative, we as Xi Jinping said to Vladimir Putin, we're building a new world, you know, you and I together. And that's Xi Jinping.
Yes.
Leaning in, saying, we and Russia. Well, if you're a European, you go, what do you mean we and Russia? I was in Beijing again in July this year and getting criticized by a Chinese audience. You know, why is Europe should be, you know, why are you picking on America's side? You know, Europe should be in the middle. You shouldn't be America's lackey. And I didn't use that term, but I'll use that term. And I said, sorry, are you missing something? We are at war in Europe, and you are supporting the country that Europe is at war with. And you expect us to have a balanced relationship? Now, I was saying this during Biden's time. Yeah. And of course, we're seeing naturally we're leaning to America because America is part of resisting what Putin is doing. Now, where is America? We don't know on this. It's at least it's trying to drive a peace. If peace is achieved under whatever terms, then the fact is then China will no longer be supporting a country that's at war with Europe. So actually our ability to do more with China will expand.
It makes sense.
It makes sense. And I think, but the problem is, remember our Fortress Europe mentality, what I was describing a minute ago. So the terms under which we operate with China, I think will be very different.
Yeah.
We will invest less over there. We will force them to invest more in us. You want to sell to Europe? Come and invest in Europe. And by the way, if you want to carry on selling into Europe, we've got to be able to sell more to you. So I think it'll become a much more transactional kind of relationship. But China, if it's losing access to the US market and is overselling, well, we know already, to the ASEAN and other markets, it's probably going to need the European market. So I think we'll be in a pretty strong position to at least negotiate.
Where do you see Europe's influence in the next few years?
Globally, kind of in general.
If we're speaking now about a world of spheres of influence, which we are.
Yeah, exactly.
It's tough to
project.
project.
It's very, I think the problem is Europe is caught between two stools. Europe should be having a strong voice in the Middle East. It's much closer to us than it is to America. We've signed up to this Arab peace plan, for Gaza. But Netanyahu's decided, forget that. I'm going back for round 2 with Hamas. And so far, at least, Trump is backing him. Where are we in Africa? I mean, Africa is our backyard. You think of the vertical, where all those critical minerals, we should be helping African countries develop those capabilities and do value added there, so employment is created in Africa and people don't come north. Now, we are doing stuff, to be fair. European governments are investing more in sub-Saharan Africa, including on energy, and there's some very interesting stuff going on. But boy, are we behind the curve compared to China. And even America is starting to invest more. And I think a Trump might want to get in there too. Minerals, real estate, deals, that's his stuff. So I think what I'm torn in my answer to you is that in the list of priorities that Europe has right now, somewhere jostling for the top are 2. Survival of Ukraine, and we've got to rebuild Europe. And to do that, we need to protect ourselves. So, your mind goes very protective. And your question is Ukraine inside that bound of protection, which I would argue it should be. But either way, it's like a double problem. We've got to protect ourselves from America and we've got to protect Ukraine. In the end, I think those 2 things will come together, because if Ukraine falls, European integration collapses, I think. I won't say the European Union will collapse, that's too hyperbolic. But how do you do deals in the European Union if some European members feel that others don't care about their security?
Yes.
And if you're in Poland or the Baltic states or Finland or Sweden and Netherlands, you will believe that other parts of Europe abandoned them because they are now less secure because Ukraine's been taken over. So I have to believe, and I'm willing to stick my neck out on this, that because everyone wants to keep the European Union together, because otherwise they can't protect themselves from a transactional America, a threatening Russia, and a very mercantilist China, that in the end they'll hang together with Ukraine rather than hang separately. A phrase I used in a Foreign Affairs article earlier this year, before things went crazy. And so I remain, I think Europe is going to have to find a way to fix itself first, then it might be able to play a role more internationally. but it can't be playing the role internationally until it feels it's on solid ground or more solid ground at home. So at the moment, you know, the home ground is tilting in all directions.
And how long do you think that retraction lasts?
At least a term of people's government, so at least 4 or 5 years.
The narrative in DC seems to be that he will not push the tariffs question
as far as
and for as long.
I mean, my feeling is that on tariffs, if Trump goes full bore on tariffs in the coming months, which he has not done so far, he seems to be using them in the transactional sense that Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, was saying, and some of his other advisors, Howard Lutnick, but certainly the Steve Moran, this guy that is being nominated to lead the Council of Economic Advisors, where you use them as a stick as leverage, because if according to the World Bank, America's consumer market is equivalent to 43% of all global consumption. You're Trump, you're saying, you want to come and eat my pie, the American consumer is your pie, you've got to pay a price to come in here. You don't get it free and then keep the jobs over there and come and eat at my table. I mean, it's a very basic way of thinking about it. So I think we're going to be in some type of trade war, probably for most of his term. The problem is Trump's got two brains. The biggest discipline will in the end be America on America. Because if he keeps scaling up the tariffs, I think it's undoubtedly the fact that the price of goods for his voters will go up, and interest rates will probably stay relatively high. And the one thing you know about Trump, he believes two things fundamentally, I think. Two things. One, tariffs are the answer to everything, and he really wants to do it and change the whole shape of the American economy back to the 1870s, where tariffs were the main source of income, and believes you should, because we've got the big pie and others want to eat it. But the other half of his brain is, I've got to be loyal to people who are loyal to me. And there's two communities loyal to him. The big money people, who also help him. And if they start to say, this is really failing and the bond markets are going back to front, and at some point he might listen to them. And secondly, if he feels his voters, who are those people who turned up for him now twice, 3 times, are loyal to him, and they start to suffer, then that, I think when those two come, which one wins?
Yes.
I think loyalty to his base and loyalty to his family and making money and to his buddies will win out over his belief that tariffs are good.
Robin, I'm going to have to leave it there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Great for the opportunity.